Attila, the feared ruler of the Huns between 434 and 453, was a leader of relentless ambition. His thirst for power, wealth, and land knew no bounds. Unlike many conquerors, Attila never suffered a single decisive defeat until the very end of his campaigns. His empire stretched from the Danube to the Baltic Sea, covering vast territories of present-day Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. In an era when the Roman Empire was crumbling under its own weight, Attila saw an opportunity rather than an obstacle, and he seized it with ruthless efficiency. According to legend, Attila possessed the Sword of Mars, a divine weapon said to have been gifted by the gods as a sign that he was destined to rule the world. This belief fueled his conviction that his reign was preordained, and he carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who saw himself as unstoppable. His rise to absolute power, however, did not come without bloodshed. In 434, after the death of his uncle Rugila, Attila shared control of the Huns with his older brother, Bleda. But Attila was not one to share power for long. By 445, historical accounts suggest that he had Bleda killed, ensuring that there was no rival to his rule. With his brother out of the way, Attila became the sole and undisputed leader of the Huns, marking the beginning of one of the most feared reigns in history. Unlike the Romans, who relied on fortified cities and professional armies, the Huns were nomadic warriors, feared for their ability to strike swiftly and disappear before retaliation. Their hit-and-run tactics made them an unpredictable and terrifying enemy. Attila mastered the art of psychological warfare, spreading fear even before his armies arrived. The mere mention of his name was enough to send villages and towns into panic, with people fleeing before the Huns even reached them. But Attila was not just a warlord, he was a shrewd strategist. He understood that brute force alone was not always the answer. Instead of engaging in costly, prolonged sieges, he often preferred to coerce, intimidate, and negotiate. His strategy was simple: demand tribute, and if refused, devastate the land. Those who yielded were spared for the time being, but those who resisted faced destruction on a scale they could scarcely imagine. Under his rule, the Huns thrived, transforming from scattered nomadic tribes into a formidable empire that challenged the dominance of Rome itself. Unlike previous barbarian leaders who had raided the empire in search of riches, Attila wanted more than gold. He wanted control. His campaigns were not just about plundering. They were about establishing dominance over an empire that had long seen itself as the ruler of the known world. Attila's reign was not just one of conquest. It was a period of fear, diplomacy, and calculated destruction. His ability to command loyalty, his unmatched military acumen, and his ruthless ambition made him one of the most formidable figures in history. Yet, as unstoppable as he seemed, his empire, like all great empires, would not last forever. Attila's military campaigns were as relentless as they were calculated. He did not wage war for the sake of war. He fought to establish dominance, to extract wealth, and to remind the world that resistance against him was futile. His armies moved with unparalleled speed, striking settlements before defenders could mount a proper resistance. His warriors were not weighed down by heavy armor or siege equipment like the Romans. Instead, they relied on mobility, fear, and sudden, overwhelming force. His empire thrived on a strategy of intimidation, and his campaigns left behind not just physical destruction, but a legacy of terror that would echo for centuries. One of his most infamous campaigns was against the Eastern Roman Empire. When Emperor Theodosius II hesitated in delivering the annual tribute that was meant to keep the Huns at bay, Attila responded with devastating force. In 441, his armies swept through the Balkans, laying waste to city after city. His most notorious act came in 442, when he razed Singajunum, modern-day Belgrade, to the ground. But this was just the beginning. In 443, he launched a second, even more brutal assault, destroying towns along the Danube and slaughtering their inhabitants. One of the most horrifying massacres took place in Naissus, present-day Niš, Serbia, where his forces left the city in ruins, its streets filled with unburied corpses. Years later, Roman diplomats who visited the abandoned city were said to have been overwhelmed by the stench of decay, a haunting reminder of Attila's wrath. His war against the Eastern Roman Empire did not end with mere destruction. When his forces failed to breach the walls of Constantinople, Attila turned to diplomacy, but on his own terms. He forced the Romans into a humiliating peace agreement in which they not only resumed their payments of tribute, but tripled the amount. This was not just a financial victory, it was a psychological one. Rome, the empire that had once ruled the known world, had now been reduced to buying peace from a man they once saw as a mere barbarian. But Attila's ambitions did not stop there. In 451, he turned his sights toward Gaul, the heartland of Western Rome. His invasion was not merely opportunistic. It was partly triggered by a dramatic and almost absurd political twist. the sister of Emperor Valentinian III Honoria, secretly sent Attila a message begging for his help in escaping an arranged marriage. She included her engagement ring as a plea for assistance. Attila, ever the opportunist, chose to interpret this not as a request for rescue, but as a marriage proposal, and in return, he demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. When Valentinian refused, Attila assembled one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen and marched into Gaul. What followed was one of the most significant battles in history, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Roman general Flavius Aetius, aware that Rome alone could not defeat Attila, forged a fragile alliance with the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes. Their combined forces met Attila's army near present-day Châlons-en-Champagne. The battle was a colossal clash of civilizations, with tens of thousands perishing on both sides. Though Attila withdrew, the battle was far from a decisive victory for Rome. The Western Empire was already crumbling, and the mere fact that Rome had needed barbarian allies to repel Attila showed how weakened it had become. Not one to accept defeat, Attila returned the next year with another campaign, this time against Italy itself. In 452, his forces crossed the Alps and swept through the northern Italian cities, burning Aquileia to the ground and reducing cities like Verona, Milan, and Padua to ashes. Rome, the eternal city, lay within his grasp. Emperor Valentinian III had no army strong enough to stop him. But then, in a remarkable twist of fate, Attila chose not to attack. Instead, he met with Pope Leo I, one of the most respected figures of the time. What exactly transpired in their meeting remains a mystery. Some say Leo offered Attila vast sums of wealth. Others believe Attila, who was deeply superstitious, was warned of divine consequences if he sacked Rome. Whatever the reason, he ordered his army to withdraw. Attila had come closer than anyone before him to breaking the Western Roman Empire, yet he had turned away at the last moment. He had terrorized the greatest empire in history, forced its leaders into submission, and reshaped the balance of power in Europe. And yet, for all his military brilliance, his empire remained built on fear and the force of his personality alone. Without Attila, could the Huns hold their dominion? The answer would come soon enough. Attila was not only a warrior, but also a man of contradictions. He led one of the most feared armies in history, yet his own personal lifestyle was far from the extravagant splendor of the empires he threatened. Unlike Roman emperors, who surrounded themselves with gold, fine fabrics, and elaborate feasts, Attila maintained a remarkably simple way of life. While his commanders dined on silver plates and indulged in luxuries taken from conquered cities, Attila himself ate meat from a wooden bowl and dressed in plain, practical clothing. His restraint in personal luxury was not out of humility, but rather a deliberate choice. He wanted to be seen as a warrior first, a ruler second. His presence was striking, but not in the way of a traditional nobleman. He was short, broad-shouldered, with a large head, small eyes, and a flat nose, features that gave him an intense and commanding look. Those who met him described his gaze as piercing and unsettling, as if he could read the thoughts of those before him. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but when he did, his words carried weight. He was known for his sharp intellect and calculated decisiveness, and while he could be ruthless, he also had an undeniable ability to inspire loyalty among his warriors. Attila's leadership was built not only on fear, but also on a deep understanding of power. He knew that the best way to rule was to keep his enemies guessing. Sometimes he would show unexpected generosity, sparing a city that expected destruction, while at other times he would wipe out entire settlements to send a clear message. He never allowed his rivals to predict his next move. Even in diplomacy, he was unpredictable. When he negotiated with Rome, he did so on horseback, never stepping down, a deliberate show of dominance and superiority. Despite his fearsome reputation, Attila enjoyed entertainment, particularly mockery and satire. In his war camps, he kept jesters and dwarfs, finding amusement in their performances. However, those close to him knew that his laughter could turn to anger in an instant. He demanded absolute respect, and those who failed to show it did not get a second chance. His temper was notorious, and his fury could be just as destructive as his armies. For all his might, Attila was not immune to superstition. He believed in omens and signs, and many of his decisions were influenced by what he perceived as messages from the gods. Before major battles, he consulted shamans and diviners, seeking their guidance. Some historians suggest that his unexpected retreat from Rome after meeting Pope Leo I was influenced by more than just politics. Perhaps he believed that harming the city would bring divine punishment. Though he had many wives, Attila remained unmarried for most of his reign. His marriages were often strategic, meant to secure alliances or solidify his rule. His final marriage, however, would prove to be the most fateful of all. On the night of his wedding to a young woman named Ildiko, he celebrated lavishly, an unusual departure from his typically restrained nature. That night would mark the end of his reign, but not in the way anyone could have expected. Attila's death was as unexpected as his rise to power. For years, he had led armies across Europe, defying the might of the Roman Empire and striking fear into the hearts of those who stood in his way. Yet in the end, it was not a battle, an enemy's blade, or an assassin's plot that ended his life. It was something far more ordinary and in some ways ironic. In the year 453, Attila took a new wife, a young woman named Ildiko. Unlike his previous marriages, which were often made for political alliances, this one seemed to be more personal. To celebrate, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, a grand wedding feast filled with drinking and revelry. That night, after years of living a life of strict discipline, he drank more than usual, and when he retired to his chambers, he never woke up again. The cause of his death remains a mystery. The most widely accepted account, recorded by the historian Jordanes, states that he suffered a sudden nosebleed in his sleep, which led to him choking on his own blood. Some speculate that years of hard living and battlefield injuries had taken a toll on his health, making him vulnerable to such an event. Others, however, suspect foul play. Could he have been poisoned by his new wife? Was his death orchestrated by rivals within his own ranks, seeking to seize power? No definitive evidence exists, but the mystery only adds to the legend of the man who had once seemed unstoppable. His funeral was as dramatic as his life. According to legend, his body was placed inside 3 coffins, one made of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, each representing different aspects of his power. The gold symbolized his wealth, the silver his diplomacy, and the iron his strength in battle. The Huns, determined to keep his final resting place a secret, went to extreme lengths to ensure it would never be found. After burying him in an unknown location, some say at the bottom of a diverted river, they killed all those who had dug his grave, ensuring that no one could reveal its whereabouts. To this day, Attila's tomb remains undiscovered, fueling endless speculation and treasure hunts. With Attila gone, the mighty empire he had built began to crumble. Unlike Rome, which had a complex system of governance, the Huns relied entirely on the strength of a single leader. Without Attila's iron will holding them together, his sons fought among themselves for power, weakening the empire from within. Just a year after his death, the Huns suffered a devastating defeat against the Germanic tribes, and within a few decades, they had all but disappeared from history as a dominant force. Though his empire did not last, Attila's legacy endured. To his people, he was a great leader who had brought them power and wealth. To his enemies, he was a relentless conqueror, a force of nature who had brought Rome to its knees. The Romans called him the Scourge of God, believing that he had been sent as divine punishment for their sins. His name became a symbol of power, destruction, and the fleeting nature of empires. Even today, Attila remains one of history's most fascinating figures, a man who rose from the vast steppes to challenge the greatest empire of his time, who inspired both terror and admiration, and whose death, shrouded in mystery, marked the end of an era. His story is a reminder that even the mightiest rulers are not immune to fate, and that in the end, no empire, no matter how powerful, can last forever.